I'm mostly a researcher, primarily, and writer, so I kind of have my presentation written out, if that's okay. I'm more of a researcher and writer than I am a speaker. But thank you all so much for having me today. I'm really glad to be here. It's such an honor to be here in Kokomo to share about this remarkable trailblazer, Mattie Cunningham Dolby, or Mattie, as she was affectionately called, who had such a deep connection throughout her life to this area. This was an area that was always close to her heart because it was home. It was always an area that she talked about with her children and that she reflected on, and she just remembered fondly throughout her life. She was raised mostly in the New London area, where her father, Richard Cunningham, who was born in bondage on a Kentucky plantation and had fled sometime after the start of the Civil War, helped run a brick-making business, and where her mother, Mary Finley Reed, ran the household and the family farm. Howard County was where Mattie's roots were deeply planted and nurtured, where her personality was shaped, where her memories were formed. She was the oldest of what would eventually be 11 siblings, and Mattie took charge of watching over them and even helped raise the youngest ones. Before she was in her teens, she was helping take care of the chickens, farming the garden, and tending to an orchard of berry bushes, and was driving a horse and buggy into New London to run errands for her family. She was also a regular visitor to Kokomo, traveling with her family to Wayman Chapel AME Church, as well as to socialize with the local black community, even as the family maintained its deep connection to the local Quakers and their membership in the Church of the Brethren, which was then referred to at that time as the German Baptist Brethren. I think Mattie would be deeply touched with being honored and remembered as she is today here in Kokomo and recently at Manchester University, which named its academic center after her and her brother Joseph Cunningham. And he had followed her to Manchester, and like Mattie, he would also transgress boundaries of his day. I really feel a deep connection to Mattie, and Joe too, which began as a journey at Bethany Theological Seminary in 2014, which is a Church of the Brethren seminary in Richmond, Indiana. When for my final paper in Church of the Brethren history with Professor Denise Kettering Lane, I wrote about Mattie. And my interest in her was inspired by Church of the Brethren historian Karen Garrett, who I always referred to as my history buddy at seminary and one of the editors of the journal Brethren, Life and Thought, and who was the first person to tell me about Mattie Cunningham. Connecting with my love for African American history, Karen stressed that Mattie became not only the first woman installed as a minister, or officially recognized as a minister, but the first and only African American woman installed as a minister in the Church of the Brethren. I understood that this was a very unusual accomplishment for an African American, doubly or even triply so for an African American woman, to achieve in a male-dominated white institution anywhere in the nation, religious or otherwise. Karen encouraged me to look into Mattie's time and life in the Brethren world and even beyond. And when I did, I was fascinated and inspired. Considering their times and what they transcended and accomplished in the face of so much adversity and systemic barriers, Mattie and even her brother Joe were indeed trailblazers. I like to think of Mattie and Joe as part of the avant-garde of their times, part of a small group of determined African Americans pushing or transgressing boundaries, creating spaces, expanding possibilities, and defying racist norms and sensibilities by their determination to follow their hearts and to live up to their potentials, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, and the feminist Mary Talbert. Beginning with their high school journeys, Mattie and Joe pushed the boundaries to graduate from what was likely a predominantly white high school, which was rare for the times. Maybe some of you here today have an idea of what school they may have attended. Integrated high schools were non-existent in the South, and even rare in the North, with the exception of some districts in the Boston area and other places, including some in the Midwest. And when we consider that because of systemic barriers, school attendance for African Americans 15 or older in 1900 was barely under 20%, and with the percentages of African Americans actually graduating from high school even lower, Mattie and Joe's high school achievements were extraordinary. Even more so when we consider that they emerged from a rural context where higher learning was not always prized and where hands were needed more on the farm than in the classroom. Mattie and Joe did not stop after high school. They took their dreams and determination to the next level and transgressed boundaries to enter Manchester University, which was a Brethren college that was all white at the time, thus by their presence bringing about integration in this academic space, which again was very rare for the times. Keep in mind that this was a time when Woodrow Wilson, for example, as president of Princeton, told a black applicant, quote, that it is altogether inadvisable for a black man to enter Princeton, following here the pattern of Southern colleges which excluded African Americans universally. Other colleges like Harvard, Brown, and Dartmouth, while admitting a few black students, still restricted access to most. To their credit, Midwestern colleges such as Indiana State University and Indiana University did begin admitting black students as early as the latter 1870s and the 1880s, respectively, but no more than a handful in the decades that followed. But Mattie was determined to ignore the views and expectations of society and go to college no matter what. While at Manchester, she worked and took a heavy course load in which she made mostly A's, and she was an active member of chorus in the Bible Society. She would likely be considered magna cum laude, the highest academic honors for a college graduate, which I don't think Manchester awarded at the time. From my research, Mattie indeed appears to have been an intellectual, with a powerful mind and maybe even a photographic memory, and on par with the great thinkers and writers of her day, such as Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. Her own words reveal a gifted, insightful writer with a deep, inquisitive mind. Her children remembered her as having an uncanny ability to know the answers to their questions with a vast reservoir of knowledge at her fingertips. Mattie not only mastered theology at Manchester, but she deeply engaged the black intellectual tradition of her day and later studied Greek and the classics at Wilberforce College, where it appears that she may have been invited as a guest lecturer. Mattie's attendance at Manchester was particularly impressive at the turn of the century, since at that time there were only 252 black female college graduates in the country, only 252 in the US, so far, far less than 0.5% of African American women were in college. The vast majority of African Americans, female or male for that matter, never even remotely had the opportunity to attend college because of systemic and class barriers that all but made it impossible for most to go to college. Mattie was a small but growing number of African American women making inroads into white colleges, thus helping to bring about early integration into these environments. And any time a black woman transgressed boundaries in the white patriarchal world of that time, as Mattie did, she had usually done so by overcoming the three structural impediments of race and gender and class, which were formidable barriers that many of us today can hardly imagine. When I think about this, I'm just in awe and determination of her. I'm just in awe of her determination and confidence and courage. Moreover, entering a traditionally exclusive white space challenged black women's enforced invisibility, and whites were forced to take notice of their presence and talents, as they did with Mattie, and Joe as well at Manchester University. Joe Cunningham appears to have also been a solid student at Manchester University, but he was perhaps a bit more extroverted than his sister, relishing group activities more than classroom academics. He was a gifted debater in the Lincoln Society, and he was the manager of the baseball team and played center on the college basketball team. Joe has left behind two photographs from his time at Manchester that were particularly intriguing and revealing. In a 1903 and 04 basketball team photograph, one of the white players has his hand on Joe's shoulder. According to a historian at the University of Wisconsin, researching early African American athletes, quote, while it was common for teammates to touch each other as a sign of cohesiveness, they generally would not touch a black teammate. He believes the photograph is rare and significant for the times, revealing something about the acceptance of Joe by his white teammates. Interestingly, this historian also believes that Joe is one of the first African Americans to play on a college basketball team in the country, and may have very well been the first to play on an integrated basketball team. It just boggles my mind to imagine that Joe may have been the first African American to play on an integrated team. I'm not sure where this historian is with this at this point. It's been about 5 years since I've spoken with him. Let me see if I can find that photograph. It was right on the, I did have it up. Wait, there it is. So that's Joe with the Lincoln and the Lincoln Society. Lincoln Debate Society. But his basketball team photograph is, okay, there he is. That's with Joe with his basketball team.
Wow.
And you know, my focus as an historian is mostly African American history, and it's mostly in the Reconstruction era and Progressive era. So immediately when I saw that photograph, I'm like, don't have a precedent for that photograph. It's so unusual.
Yeah, and you gotta think, when you look at sports today, basketball today, if he might have started it, what would we do without the African American, sports athlete today? When you go to a Lakers game, or a Pacers game, it's like, could you imagine he might have started it?
Well, that's what the historian at the University of Michigan actually thinks, or Wisconsin thinks. He thinks Joe was maybe the first. And he thought, so it's really, he looked at these photographs too, and he thought it was very unusual and very significant for the times. And he said it's also just unusual how you could tell that Joe's accepted by his white teammates. You see that one player has his arm on Joe's shoulder, and there he is. So
it's also interesting to think that maybe the photographer wasn't on board with that. Maybe the photographer had some opposition to his hand being on his shoulder.
That's a good point.
Yet he still was able to snap that shot.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point, because it does appear
that when somebody goes against their own beliefs because the team says this is how it's going to go down.
Yeah. It looks like the team is saying there, this is how it's going to go down.
Right. He's on our team, whether you like it or not. Your opinions don't matter here. Do you want paid to take the photo or not?
Yeah.
That happened, probably.
Yeah, that's a good point. There were probably people that were really offended by that photograph, including possibly the photographer who took it. Yeah, that's really interesting. The second photograph, let me pull that one up. So the second photograph shows Joe in a large group picture of the Lincoln Society, and maybe even more revealing than the first. Here he is sitting in front center of 30 white students, which is unusual since it seems to show that rather than sheepishly tucking away the one black student in the group photograph, Joe's prominently visible placement may reveal a source of pride among his peers. But what also makes this photograph exceptionally rare is that Joe is also sitting in between two white female students in intimate proximity that was considered taboo in much of early 20th century America. So I thought that one was also really unusual. And again, I didn't, again, when I saw these, I was like, even as somebody who's seen a lot of photographs from this time period, this was something extremely rare and unusual, I thought. These photographs, along with Joe and Mattie's collegiate involvement and accomplishments, reveal racial attitudes at Manchester University that appear to be remarkably progressive compared to most other institutions of higher learning of the day. But keep in mind that Mattie and Joe certainly had some role in this change by crossing boundaries into this white world, persuading that world to not only accommodate them, but to take notice of their intellects and talents, and they perhaps convinced that world, or many of their peers at least, to revise some of their racially biased assumptions of African Americans. I like to think that they created change in their corner of the world that really rarely occurred anywhere else. And let me point out that they did incur racism their first semester at Manchester. And in fact, it looks like that they weren't welcome in the cafeteria, and that the student body president actually reached out to them and invited him over to their table with his group. And then that sort of began to change things. So they were actually uncomfortable, made to feel uncomfortable during their first semester. So I think that should help change things. And then I think just them, just going at it full force, doing what they love, and following their hearts also led to some changes, at least among some students, I think. Soon after graduating in 1904, Mattie became a successful black missionary in Arkansas for the Church of the Brethren, and an ardent lobbyist for white funding to black communities. Let me pull up a picture of her. That's a picture of her from the Messenger magazine, a 1976 article. That's a Church of the Brethren publication that did a really good piece on her in 1976. So that's her probably, let's say probably around maybe 1920 or so. But the picture of her from Manchester, which is one of my favorites, is this one. So, what was that? That's a really interesting photograph. Soon after graduating college, while in the mission field and later as a Brethren pastor, Mattie wrote for the church's publications, revealing not only a keen awareness of the rising currents of black thought and literary expression of the day, but internalizing the black voices of her day, making them her own. Her pieces, often written to urge whites to devote their resources to help impoverished black communities and to remind them of the intrinsic value and accomplishments of African Americans of her day, echoed the black writers of her day, such as Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and especially black women activists and educators of her day, such as Professor Josephine Yates, feminist Mary Talbert, and the anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells. Over and over, her writing is oriented toward racial pride and dignity, while sometimes lambasting the racism that tried to hold African Americans down. For example, Mattie sounds like Du Bois in his classic The Souls of Black Folk, which had been out for about a year, when she writes, "The history of the Negro is the history of a downtrodden and neglected race. American boast of our freedom and Christianity, but we, American Negroes, have known little but to be abused and misled." She wrote that in probably what was a fairly conservative Brethren publication at the time. So I thought that was interesting. Not long after her time in the mission field in Arkansas, Mattie married Newton Dolby, who was an engineer at Wilberforce College, a flourishing school started by black and white abolitionists for African Americans, and with whom she would bear 6 children. Newton's father, Wiley Dolby, was an ordained Brethren minister before his death in 1905. Their marriage thus combined 2 of the earliest and few black Brethren families. Mattie began visiting traditional black Brethren churches in Frankfort, Washington Church, and Circleville, Ohio. Mattie began focusing on the teetering Frankfort Brethren congregation located in Jeffersonville, Ohio, whose members included ex-enslaved persons, and where she worked to revive this congregation, which over the years had lost so many members to a competing AME congregation. Soon she was made a deacon in this church by the Church of the Brethren leadership, and not long after that, Mattie made history by becoming the first woman installed as a minister in a traditional white male-dominated church. On December 31st, 1911, during Love Feast at the Frankfort Church, Mattie Dolby became not only the first woman installed as a minister, or officially recognized as a minister, but the first and only African American woman installed as a minister in the church. Placing her accomplishment within a broader context during this time, African American women lived in a racist society where they had to contend with 2 major disadvantages. They were both black and female. They were, in this sense, as Harvard historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham has called it, doubly disempowered, an underprivileged status that reached back to slavery. This status made them vulnerable to white supremacy, which prevented them from mobility in a white patriarchal world. Yet, in one corner of that white universe, Mattie had broken through that impenetrable white barrier, which was all but unheard of for a black woman in those times. Thus, while the Brethren were not as rigid in their racial views compared to mainstream white society, they had been anti-slavery since their founding and had at least accommodated some black members. She had become an African-American female minister in a ministerial field dominated mostly by privileged white men of German descent. Mattie ministered at the Frankfort Church for 5 years before relocating to Mount Morris in 1915, after Newton was offered a position as engineer in the central heating plant at Mount Morris College in Illinois, which was then another Brethren college, which I don't believe exists today. While there, she and her family attended a Brethren church in town, which appears to have had only white members. It's interesting to consider that Mattie and her family may have brought about integration also in this Brethren church by their presence and participation. 2 years later, the family moved to Urbana, Ohio, likely because Newton had gotten a job there. While there, the family attended the Springfield, Ohio Church of the Brethren, which is about 25 miles away, which was another congregation that was evidently all white. But that's where she ran into some problems. In 1924, after attending that church for 7 years, a new administration took over, and they quietly asked the family to find another church to go to closer to home. The Mattie's children would later attribute racial prejudice as the motive behind this request. And it was a request that led Mattie to leave the Church of the Brethren for good. One can only imagine the hurt and humiliation the Dolbys felt to be treated as outcasts in their own church. At 46 years old, Mattie Dolby had spent her life up to that point in a Brethren tradition that was deeply, deeply part of her identity. To sever that connection for good required something egregious, as well as perhaps an accumulation of microaggressions inflicted by white brethren. But rather than appealing their mistreatment or moving on to another Brethren congregation, the Dolbys essentially protested with their feet. They walked out of the Brethren Church and through the doors of the welcoming St. Paul's AME Church in Urbana, and then, after Newton's untimely death, into the Church of God, where she would serve as a church planter and leader, and where she taught and nurtured young people, many of whom would go on to Anderson College, I believe, which is today Anderson University. She would be a leader in this church until her untimely death in 1956, and she's credited with nurturing an untold number of future church leaders in this denomination, as well as community leaders. Racism was always prevalent in the backdrop of everywhere Mattie lived and navigated, as sadly we can all too easily imagine today. The Ku Klux Klan soared in membership nationally and was particularly strong in Ohio. There's a troubling photograph dated September 8, 1923, of a nighttime KKK march through the center of Springfield, Ohio, with onlookers dressed in suits and holding their hats in respect as the hooded procession passes by. Such a racist climate may have had a connection to what happened to the Dolbys the following year in Springfield, and certainly reveals that the town's Church of the Brethren was not the only place where this black family was not welcome. Urbana, Ohio, also where they lived, had a dark racist underbelly, like many other Ohio cities and towns. 2 decades before the Dolbys arrived there, white residents had blasted their way into the local jail with guns to get to a black man named Charles Mitchell, who was accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. The mob then tortured him to death before hanging him, and then placed his battered body on public display for a day. It was so shocking and gruesome that even newspapers all over the nation picked it up and ran stories about it. The trauma of this brutal public execution was certainly still deep in the memory bank of the small Urbana black community when the Dolby family had arrived there almost 2 decades later. And despite the Church of the God's emphasis on visible unity and early attempts at integration, churches within the denomination were segregated, as they were in the Church of the Brethren for the most part, with white and black ones sometimes in the same town. This separation was the case with the church that Mattie Dolby helped start, even though there had been a white Church of God in Urbana since 1910. Once again, the color line ran through a church where she would make a significant contribution, and African Americans were really relegated, even in that church, to second-class status. Mattie Dolby was a pioneer in the Church of the Brethren, an empowered woman of her times. As a black woman in late 19th and early 20th century America, where African Americans were severely prescribed by racist boundaries, and where women were repressed by patriarchy, she transgressed those boundaries with remarkable skill and determination. A rural farm girl, Dolby achieved higher education in a white Brethren institution against the protest of her father even, and against the exclusionist orientation of the larger world of white male-centric academia. She became a successful black missionary in the South and an ardent lobbyist for white funding. And she made history as the first woman installed as a minister in a traditionally white church whose ministerial leadership was completely dominated by males. And this 11 years before women in the Church of the Brethren would be officially licensed as ministers. While she reflected Brethren humility in her life and work, Dolby used her pen to speak with a clear and critical voice about the poverty and indignities suffered by African Americans, and the need for whites to commit more of their hearts and resources to uplift impoverished African Americans. She also echoed the black writers and thinkers of her day, such as Mary Tolbert, Josephine Yates, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, who provided her with a bridge to a black intellectual tradition that was sorely missing from her white religious context. I want to end here with what I said near the beginning. I like to think of Mattie and her brother Joe as part of the larger African American avant-garde of their times, pushing and expanding old boundaries, bringing something new to traditional spaces, and helping to change perceptions. And in my opinion, particularly at Manchester University, but even beyond, helping to make their world far more interesting. Thank you. To inspire them to change their academic center in honor of Mattie and Joe Cunningham last May. So that is some of their descendants there at the ceremony for the Cunningham Academic Center. So that was really cool to see so many of their descendants there last May. They're probably 50, might have been about 100 or so. I say 50, but it was a lot more than even there. And it was just an amazing event. And not only did they name the Academic Center after Mattie and Joe Cunningham, But they've also, if you go in there, they have an exhibit that details their lives, it's a chronological exhibit that kind of details their lives, so it's really interesting. So that was really, really cool to be a part of that and to see that. And then after I went to Urbana and found Mattie's grave, so, and what you're seeing there is after I spent a long time cleaning it up. You barely see her name, you can see her daughter's name underneath. It's also buried there. But it was just covered in the moss and you could barely see it. So I scrubbed and at least got it so you could at least see it. And that's another view of the Cunningham Academic Center, so it's pretty impressive.
They don't have a lip on that, do they?
No. And I was laughing because there's a Starbucks in there too. The Cunningham Academic Center, there's a Starbucks. I thought that was kind of funny. Okay, there's their cutting ceremony. So that's the official ribbon ceremony for the Academic Center. And those are her relatives, her family, her descendants, all her loved ones. So that was a really neat picture. So, yeah.
Can you mention again, I'm sorry, I don't know you said it already, but her relationship to Anderson University?
Yeah, so after she left the Church of the Brethren because of racism, and then she went to AME Church. And by the way, she maintained connections. She was always still going back and forth at AME. They did, even her family, when she grew up, they were members of the Church of the Brethren, but they would go to the Friends meeting, and then they would go to AME Church as well. So they always had that connection between those churches. But so she went to, the last church she went to was Church of the God, where she actually became a minister, and I can't determine if she was officially recognized as a minister there. I've been in contact with Anderson, and they can't tell either. But she was a preacher there, church planter, and she really nurtured a lot of young people. So that was her connection to that. And so a lot of people she nurtured, she encouraged them to go to Anderson College and to get their degrees, particularly African American men and women. She was encouraging them to go to college, get your degree. And so many of them did.
Yeah. I went my first year of college to Anderson University.
Oh, was it? Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
I passed by there on the way here, and I thought, gosh, I wish I had time. I'd like to jump off the interstate and go explore the university a little bit. Well, that's really neat that you went there. Is that your denomination? Is it still a Church of the God School, or is it just kind of?
Yes. Well, is that the same Church of God in Christ?
I think so. I think so, but I'm not 100%
Okay.
about that. That's cool that you went there. Yeah. And that's where she was at until she passed in 1956. And she really passed, I think it was 1951, where she was in a car accident. She sustained some really bad injuries, and I think that's the reason she ended up finally succumbing to the complications from those injuries in 1956. But, yeah. And then I know her one daughter, part of her family stayed in the AME Church in Urbana and never left. And one daughter, I think, wrote a history of the Urbana AME Church. So yeah, it's very, very, very interesting what they were able to do. And you know, Church of the Brethren also, you know, though it accommodated African American members, it was anti-slavery. Like few denominations in the U.S., even the Quakers cannot boast that from their very founding they were anti-slavery, but Church of the Brethren was anti-slavery from their founding. But still, they were still susceptible to the racist climate of the day. And so I think it was kind of a mixed bag being part of that church, where it did accommodate them and it, you know, welcomed them to some degree, but then at the same time kind of held them at arm's length and said, yeah, we want you to be part of a church, but we kind of want you to be in your own churches, basically. And so I think it was probably for Mattie, it was part of her identity, and she loved the church. She grew up in it. She considered Manchester University her love. She considered that one of the loves of her life. But I think that was a mixed bag for her, because I think she also from the beginning knew that, you know, encountered, you know, went up against
You're a part of it, but you're not.
Yeah, and went up against some of the racism. I'm sure there was a lot of microaggressions going on from the beginning, you know, and that she encountered Joe as well. And when she did leave the Church of the Brethren, I don't think any of the family, I think the whole family left. Nobody ever went back once they left. And it's something that I talk to like Church of the Brethren historians today, and they have such regrets about that. You know, something they couldn't do anything about, of course, but they just have such regrets that there wasn't more done at the time to try to make them feel more welcome. So,
Are you able to say, or do you know where a lot of her family resides? Or where they live?
yeah, well, all over. Some in California, one in St. Pedro, one of the family historians, but a lot of them are still here in the Midwest. Yeah, a lot of them are still here in the Midwest. Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, California. One of her family historians lives in Washington, D.C. area. And I think he's really maintaining the website, the family history website. So, and then I think one is in, I think Chicago maybe. And that's another interesting thing. So you notice I didn't say much about Joe and what ended up happening to Joe because I don't really know. And I couldn't, and his family doesn't really know. Joe ends up becoming a medical doctor and going to Chicago and practicing. But he sort of, but you don't hear anything else about him. You can't find anything about him. And so I asked the family, and nobody really knows what ended up, other than he became a medical doctor in Chicago. Nobody knows really what happened to Joe. And I'd be really interested, and hopefully I'll be able to find out more of what happened to Joe. I like to think that he was probably, hopefully, using his expertise to serve, underprivileged communities in Chicago. I know that when she lost her husband, and Mattie kind of went, into a kind of depression for a while, because her husband Newton died prematurely of a heart attack in the 1920s. And after that, you could just tell that there's a difference in her. She kept going forward, but you could tell that she carried this sadness with her for the rest of her life. At least I feel like that was the case. And she did go and spend some time in Chicago with her brother Joe. She did live in Chicago and some other areas. Let's see what other pictures I have. Oh yeah, so Janine Wine, who's a historian at Manchester University, said that one of Mattie's descendants knew I was speaking here today, and they wanted to try to overnight me some things that they just found. And she just sent these to me this morning. And she said this is from a comic book that one of her descendants had written. So that was kind of cool. Yeah. You kind of see that. So what I didn't mention is one of the reasons, I don't think I mentioned this, is one of the reasons she left the mission field. There's so much interesting things she has to say about Arkansas when she was there, about the intense racism and the backdrop of brutal lynchings there. And that she was really, really speaking out against. And she talked about how whites just enforced poverty of African Americans, and it was so bad that it was just unbelievable how people lived there. And so that's when she kept telling the brethren, she goes, hey, you all have resources, you need to do something to help. And she kept on pounding on white brethren, you've got to do something to help. And they did, they tried, she did manage to raise quite a bit of money, but just not enough. And then she suffered from malaria, which was pretty prevalent in the South during that time. And she finally had to come back. And I mentioned this, so she was known as Aunt Mattie. They referred to as Aunt Mattie, her family, and then when she was in Church of the Brethren, all the kids and young people referred to her as Aunt Mattie. What else do I have? Oh, so this is another thing that Jeanine included, which I didn't know. Evidently, she's in this book. She's included in George Lee's book, Interesting People, Black American History Makers, collection. She's in there with Malcolm X and Harriet Tubman and so forth. So she's included. There's a little biographical piece about Mattie in that book. So I need to get that book. Jeanine just sent me that this morning from one of Mattie's descendants wanted me to have that. Know about that. So that's kind of cool. And you know what? She didn't do anything like earth-shattering like Harriet Tubman or Malcolm X. She did, just what she did and what she accomplished was just amazing. Because her father didn't want her to go to college. He said, your place is to have babies and run home. And she goes, no, my place is to graduate from high school and go to college. So he said, fine, you go to college, but I'm not paying your way. I'll pay for your brother Joe, but I'm not going to pay your tuition. She said, fine. She goes, I'll work my way through. And she did. She worked her way through. She worked while she was going to Manchester University. Or I guess it was Manchester College at the time. And I think probably there's other pictures I have. I think that's it. Yeah, I think those are the pictures. Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to, any
Yeah,
questions or anything they'd like to share?
No, I learned a lot.
Well, another thing is, her father was born an enslaved person on a Kentucky plantation who was evidently biracial. His mother had been raped by, the family story says his mother had been raped by the overseer of the plantation. And that was Richard. And he watched his whole family be sold, separated from them, watched them be sold in the Deep South, so he lost his whole family. And then when the Civil War broke out, he had had enough, and that's when he fled the plantation. He basically used the Underground Railroad to get to Indiana. I'm sorry?
I'm glad you called it a rape and not a romance.
No, it was, no, and the family even says, it's interesting because I'm working on a book on PBS Pinchback now, Blanche Kelsey Bruce, actually 2 books. It was 1 book, but now they're going to split it up into 2. And PBS Pinchback was the first African-American governor who, 1872, a lot of people think it was Douglas Wilder of Virginia, but it was PBS Pinchback in 1872. And then Blanche Kelsey Bruce was the first African-American to serve a full 6-year term in the U.S. Senate from 1875 to 1881. And so, Blanche Kelsey Bruce's father was the plantation owner. And I just don't hold back. I definitely think it was rape.
Yeah.
He had no
'Cause they're
connection to
under
her at
duress.
all. It was,
Yeah,
even though he provided, he left her things in his will and so forth, but he definitely abused her.
yeah, it was not I'm sure it wasn't a consensual, mutual relationship.
Whereas Pinchback is his father was white too, but it's a little different story. His father was really interesting because they're from Danville, Virginia, and his father actually left his white wife for his enslaved person. But not only did that, he took her and freed her in Philadelphia, and then went down to Mississippi and started life with her, and plantation with her. So it was, power dynamics are still there. He still had power over her to do what he wished, but at the same time, I gotta recognize her agency in this too, because she seemed like she did want to be, from what I can see, wanted to be with him, wanted to start a family, and she did seem to have some say in her own freedom and had some say of moving away from that white family that was not gonna recognize their relationship.
What brought Richard to Howard County or New London?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question because I'm not really sure what exactly brought him here. I've been trying to find that out, why he came here. I just know a lot of people did end up coming to Indiana from the South, particularly from the Kentucky borderland and the Kentucky area where he was from. So I'm not sure, other than maybe he had some connections here. There could have been some connections, or he knew that there was a community here that would
There was New London
assist him.
Friends.
New London Friends, there was the Friends, and there was a free African-American community in the area, so that's the reason a lot of people did end up here, because they knew there would be Quakers, friendly whites, and African-American free communities where they could come and that they would find some assistance. So it's the only thing I can think of. But I've been trying to locate him before that. I've been trying to locate him in Kentucky. I'm having a hard time. The family store keeps saying he's from a Kentucky plantation, and I've searched so many records, and I just can't find him yet. So I'm hoping one day I'll locate exactly where he was in Kentucky, what plantation, where he was, where he lived. And just find
There's a
out.
lot of people here that are good at that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of people here at this library that are good at that.
yeah,
Going through records like that, like him and some of them.
yeah.
He's turning around, don't look at me. But there's a genealogy department here, and they're real good at going through
Yeah.
census.
Then, yeah.
I
It'd
could
be
go
great if
on
they would do
that.
that, locate him in Kentucky, locate Richard.
They have time, you
Yeah.
know. I
Yeah.
think they're volunteers, so,
Mhm.
but yeah, they're really good at that.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of other things in this family, some of the other family members are missionaries, including going over to Sierra Leone. There's one story of a relative, in fact, I think it was it Mattie's mother's, I think Mattie's mother was married before her first husband. I think this is the case. And he was really light complected, and he was always burdened by the indignity suffered by African Americans. And he said he had enough, and he said, I'm gonna pass into the white world. He could do that. And they said he passed into the white world and married a white woman, and they never heard from him again. Yeah. And so that was another thing, another family story that I found. Of him passing and just never coming back. But as a historian during that time, I'm finding a lot of those stories. of people passing. I find people passing back and forth, actually. I even find stories of whites even passing for black if it was to their advantage, believe it or not. There was the editor of the, I think it was called the Louisiana Tribune, a newspaper. He was Belgian, and it was one of the most black activist newspapers considered in the country. A lot of people didn't know he was white, so they always thought he was a black editor, so he just let them think he was a black editor of this activist newspaper, and he never corrected it. So like, that's interesting, so he's passing for black, because it's actually to his advantage of what he's trying to do. And he's Belgian. So, but yeah. So, yeah. And I'd like to find more out about, a little more about Joe too, Joe's involvement in sports, because evidently they said he was a really good athlete, good basketball player. I don't know if he played any other sports. He was captain, I believe, of the baseball team. They said he was a really gifted debater, but I think Mattie was really the brainy one of the two. She was really, really brainy and deeply, deeply intellectual. And her children seemed to imply that she had a photographic memory. That everything was always there, and she remembered everything. She could retrieve it just like that. Well, any more questions? Feel free to ask anything.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned so much,
Yeah.
that's why I
Excellent
came.
program.
And this is their home. I mean, this was their home. You know, they were raised here near Kokomo, and they always, you know, had
And they
fun
went to school
memories.
here and
Yeah.
all that.
And that's what I'd like to find
Amazing.
more out about the school they went to. Evidently, it was an integrated school. That was kind of unusual. I know there were some in the Midwest, but I'd like to find if anybody ever finds out anything more about where they went to high school, and, you know, were there other African-American students at that high school as well? I find some of these stories, you know. Like another person that I've written about, I've written a screenplay with his grandniece. His name's William Monroe Trotter. We haven't gotten anywhere with the screenplay yet, but we're trying. He was sort of like, if you combine Malcolm X and Dr. King and threw them back 50 years ahead of their time, that's what this guy was like. He was trying to basically do what the civil rights movement was doing. He was doing it during their time. And he had gone to an all-white high school in Boston area, and was the only black student, became student body president, graduate honors, and then went to Harvard College. So you hear some of these stories sometimes, and they're unusual, but they're really interesting. So I'd like to find out more about were they the only black students at their white high school, or were there others? And they appear to have done really well. And were they accepted at their high school, or by some students, or all the students? So, you know, I'd like to know more about that. Unravel that a little more. Yep.
All right, let's give Nick a hand. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh,
I learned a lot.
you're very welcome. Sure.